The instant the millionaire touched the feverish brow of his housekeeper's baby, a vision overwhelmed him. He saw the same baby dying in his arms 200 years ago, and this time, he knew exactly what to do. It was 3:17 a.m. when frantic pounding on the front door of Crestwood Manor echoed through the marble hallway. Richard Blackwood awoke with a jolt of irritation. Who dared disturb his sleep at this hour? He lived alone in this fortress of glass and steel, precisely to avoid the world, to avoid the memories, to avoid the pain that had haunted him for 3 long years. More pounding, this time accompanied by crying, not an adult's cry, a baby's cry. Sharp, desperate, and, strangely, familiar. Richard descended the staircase, his silk dressing gown hastily tied, his silvering hair, impeccably combed during the day, now disheveled. At 38, he had built a medical technology empire. Ironic. Technology that saves lives, but had failed to save the one life that mattered most. When he opened the door, the rain slashed inwards, and there, soaked to the bone, stood Emily Carter, his housekeeper, the woman who cleaned his manor 3 times a week, and with whom he exchanged at most a quick good morning and goodbye. But tonight, she wasn't alone. In her arms, wrapped in a saturated blanket that offered no protection, a 9-month-old baby cried with an intensity that made Richard's chest tighten. Emily. Only now did the millionaire notice, had immense hazel eyes that, at this moment, overflowed with tears that mingled with the rain. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice cracking. "The county hospital is overflowed. They told me to come back tomorrow. But my son, he's burning up with fever. I don't know what else to do. I have no one else. Please." Richard looked at the woman. Housekeeper's uniform still visible beneath a thin jacket that offered no defense against the downpour. Worn sneakers, wet black hair plastered to her face. 29 years old, maximum. And in her arms, that baby cried, and cried. He was going to say no. He was going to tell her to call an ambulance. He was going to close the door. He was going to retreat back into his chosen solitude. But then the baby coughed, and in that sound, in that specific pattern of cough followed by a sharp whimper, something inside Richard snapped. "Come in," he heard his own voice say. Emily almost stumbled as she entered, such was her urgency. Richard closed the door. The silence of the manor was replaced by the child's incessant crying. "What's his name?" Richard asked, still unsure why he was asking. "Ethan," Emily replied, rocking the baby in her arms without success. "Ethan Carter." Richard froze. Ethan. The name echoed within him like an ancient bell. Ethan. Why did that name make his heart race? Why did he feel like he had said that name thousands of times, in another life? "Let's go to the living room," Richard said, guiding Emily toward the area illuminated by soft lighting. The contrast was stark. Her poor, soaked, desperate him. A millionaire in a silk robe, in his glass palace. "How long has he been like this?" Richard asked, approaching them. "Since last night. The fever won't break. I've given him medicine. I've given him lukewarm baths. Nothing works. He's only getting worse." "May I?" Richard extended his hands. "May I hold him?" Emily hesitated for only a second before entrusting the most precious thing she had to a man who, to her, was merely the cold employer who barely looked her in the eye. Richard took the baby, and the moment his fingers touched the feverish skin of Ethan's forehead, the world exploded. Have you ever felt that you know someone you just met? That a voice, a touch, a look awakens memories that you have never lived? In this life? The vision was quick, less than 3 seconds, but intense as a lightning strike. He saw a small room, stone walls, flickering candles, a woman in a Victorian blue embroidered dress, jewels at her neck, weeping, and in his arms, dressed as a doctor, wearing a worn brown smock, a baby. The same baby, dying. Richard staggered. He almost dropped Ethan. Emily screamed and snatched her son back. "Mr. Blackwood, are you all right?" Richard steadied himself on the sofa, His heart pounded so hard he could hear the blood in his ears. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead. He looked at Emily, at those hazel eyes, and he knew, deep in his soul, he knew. I know that cry, Richard whispered. What do you mean? Emily clutched Ethan tighter, confused and frightened. Richard shook his head, trying to organize thoughts that made no sense. Nothing. I'm sorry. Sit down. I'll get the thermometer. He went upstairs, almost running. In the bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. He was pale. His hands trembled. This was madness. Visions. Impossible memories. He was a man of science, of logic, of hard data. But when he grabbed the digital thermometer from the cabinet, his hand automatically went to another shelf, and without understanding why, he also grabbed a stethoscope he had received as a gift years ago from a doctor friend. He had never used it, didn't even know how to use it. Or did he? Back in the living room, Emily had removed Ethan's wet blanket. The baby wore only a diaper and a white undershirt. His skin was flushed, his eyes swollen from crying so much. And the crying. That relentless crying. Richard knelt beside the sofa where Emily was sitting. He took his temperature, 104.5 degrees. That's very high, Richard murmured. When was the last time he ate? He hasn't eaten anything today, he just throws up. And his diaper. Dry, he hasn't peed in hours. Richard picked up the stethoscope and, without thinking, placed it in his ears. He placed the diaphragm against Ethan's small chest. He listened. The rapid breathing, the accelerated heartbeat, and something else, something wrong with the rhythm. Emily watched in astonishment. Why would a millionaire technology executive know how to use a stethoscope like a doctor? He's dehydrated, Richard said, his voice technical, precise. Heart rate is way too elevated. Respiratory pattern suggests a systemic infection. Emily blinked. Are you a doctor, Mr. Blackwood? Richard looked at his own hands holding the stethoscope. No, I'm not. But those words, that knowledge, where did they come from? He touched Ethan's forehead again, and this time he paid attention, not just to the fever, but to the cry, to the pattern. 3 short sobs, a pause, 1 long whimper, another pause, start again. He knew that pattern. He knew it as well as he knew his own breath. Mr. Blackwood, you're scaring me, Emily said, clutching Ethan against her chest. Richard stood up abruptly. We have to get him to the hospital now. My driver will take us. You said the county was crowded? Yes. They told them to wait. Let's get down to brass tacks. County hospital. I have contacts there. Mr. Blackwood, I don't have the money to... I'll take care of it, Richard interrupted. Get him into something dry. Do you have clean clothes for him? Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't bring anything. I ran out of the house. Richard went upstairs again. He opened the closet in the room that had been his son's, the room he'd kept locked for 3 years. The clothes were still there, small, meant for a 3-year-old, but in the back, there were some from when Gabriel was 9 months old. Gabriel, his son, killed in a car accident 3 years ago. His wife was driving. It was raining, just like tonight. Both died instantly. Richard grabbed a clean, dry blanket. He went downstairs. He handed it to Emily. Wrap him up in this. While Emily changed the blanket, Richard called his driver. 15 minutes. The man lived 15 minutes away. 15 minutes, that could be too late. No, Richard thought. Not this time. He looked at Ethan. At that little face, flushed with fever. At those half-closed little eyes. And an absolute certainty. Irrational. Impossible. Washed over him. I already lost you once. I won't lose you again. Emily looked at him confused. What did you say? Nothing, Richard lied. The car is coming. But as they waited, Richard couldn't stop looking. at Ethan, at Emily. And one word kept hammering in his head. Ethan. 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 He'd held that baby before. He'd felt that feverish skin. He'd heard that cry. And the last time, he had failed. The driver arrived. Richard picked Ethan up, cradling him gently as Emily settled into the back seat of the Mercedes. The child was crying weakly now, which was worse. It meant he was getting weaker. On the way to the hospital, with the rain pounding against the glass and the city lights blurring outside, Richard looked down at the baby in his arms. And Ethan, even with the fever, even in pain, opened his eyes and looked at Richard. In that look, for a split second, Richard saw recognition, as if the baby were saying, "I know you," which made Richard hold the child tighter and whisper so low that even Emily didn't hear, "I know you too." They arrived at County Hospital in 20 minutes. Richard got out carrying Ethan. Emily hurried behind him. The emergency room reception area was empty at that hour. "I need a pediatrician." "Now," Richard said to the receptionist, using the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sir, you need to fill out the forms. I am Richard Blackwood. Call Dr. Miller. He'll take care of it." 5 minutes later, Dr. Miller, the hospital's chief pediatrician and an old acquaintance of Richard's because of the years of donations he had made to the institution, appeared still buttoning his lab coat. "Richard, what?" "It's urgent," Richard said, handing over Ethan. "Fever of 109.4, dehydrated, not urinating, crying pattern." He stopped. How could he explain that he knew the crying pattern of a baby he barely knew? Dr. Miller took Ethan and went straight to the emergency room. Emily followed. Richard, too. The next 30 minutes were a blur. Tests, IV drip, medication. Questions that Emily answered in a trembling voice while Richard stood by, useless, watching. And then, Dr. Miller came out of the room with a serious expression. "It's a systemic infection, bacterial sepsis. Probably started as a simple urinary tract infection that wasn't treated and progressed. He needs to be admitted. Intravenous antibiotics and hydration, continuous monitoring." Emily burst into tears. "Is my son going to die? Not if we treat it now." But it was close. A few more hours and he didn't need to finish. Richard felt his legs weaken. Sepsis, systemic infection. In 1820, without antibiotics, without IV drips, without a hospital, it was a death sentence. And suddenly he knew, with absolute certainty, Ethan had died of that. In the other life. In the life that Richard was beginning to remember in terrifying flashes. "Do everything necessary," Richard said. "I'll pay all the costs." Dr. Miller nodded. Emily looked at Richard with a gratitude so profound it hurt. "Mr. Blackwood, why are you doing this?" Richard looked at Ethan, now with an IV line in his little arm, finally sleeping, the fever starting to come down. "Because," Richard said slowly, "I owed it to him." Emily frowned, confused, but Richard didn't explain. How could he? Ethan was transferred to a private room. Emily stayed next to the hospital crib, holding her son's little hand. Richard stayed in the armchair beside her, watching. It was almost 6 in the morning when Emily finally spoke. "You should go home. Get some rest." "No," Richard said, I'll stay." "Why?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked at Ethan, at the monitor showing his vital signs stabilizing, at life being saved. "Because this time," Richard thought but didn't say aloud, "I arrived in time." Emily, exhausted, finally fell asleep in the recliner next to the crib. The dawn light began to stream through the window. Richard remained awake, thinking, remembering. Or was it reliving? That's when he saw it. Ethan, asleep, had his little left arm outside the swaddle, and on his ankle, very small, a birthmark. Richard sat on the edge of the chair. His heart raced again. The mark was irregularly shaped, almost like her crescent moon. And without thinking, without understanding where the impulse came from, Richard picked up his cell phone. He opened the Notes app and drew. He drew the mark, the exact shape, the position on the left ankle. The details that his fingers knew but his eyes had never seen. When he finished, he looked at the drawing on his phone, then at Ethan's ankle. They were identical. He had drawn the mark before seeing it clearly. Richard was shaking. This was impossible. Completely impossible. Unless he had already seen that mark before, in another life, when he was caring for another baby. The same baby. Ethan. Richard got up, ran his hand through his hair. He needed air. He left the room. He walked through the empty hospital corridors, his mind spinning. Reincarnation, past life, souls that meet again. Nonsense. Superstition. Impossible. But then how did he explain it? How did he explain the vision? How did he explain knowing the crying pattern? How did he explain knowing how to use a stethoscope he had never held? How did he explain drawing a mark he had never seen? How did he explain the deep, visceral certainty that he had known that baby for 200 years? Richard returned to the room. Emily was still asleep. Ethan too, but now his breathing was calm. The monitor showed his fever coming down. Steady heartbeat. He was going to make it. This time he was going to make it. Richard sat back down, and looking at the sleeping mother and son, he whispered the words that made no sense, but were the only true thing he knew. I promised I would save you. And I did. Found outside. The rain stopped. A new day began. And Richard Blackwood, a 38-year-old millionaire businessman, a man of science and logic, had to face an impossible truth. Some promises are just too strong for a single lifetime, and some souls, they find each other again. For the next 3 days, Richard didn't leave the hospital. His secretary kept calling with urgent appointments, board meetings, multi-million-dollar contracts waiting to be signed. He cancelled it all. For the first time in 15 years of his career, the Blackwood empire took a back seat, because there was something more important, something he couldn't explain but knew deep down in his soul. He needed to be there near Ethan, as if his presence was necessary for the child to survive. It's just a coincidence, Richard repeated to himself every time the irrational thought returned. You're projecting the loss of Michael. You're seeing patterns where there are none. Past life memories don't exist. Reincarnation is superstition. But then Ethan would wake up and look at Richard, and in that look, there was recognition. A 9-month-old baby shouldn't recognize strangers like that. Shouldn't. Stop crying just because Richard held his hand. Shouldn't smile only for him, Emily noticed. How could she not notice? You're very kind, Mr. Blackwood, she said on the morning of the second day, as Richard returned with coffee for her. But I don't understand why. I'm just your housekeeper. Ethan is just... She hesitated, as if afraid to offend. Just a poor child. Richard sat down in the armchair next to the crib. He looked at Ethan, sleeping peacefully now, the fever finally under control, the antibiotic taking effect. He's not just nothing, Richard said, his voice firmer than he intended. He stopped. How to explain? He's special. Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. To me, he's everything. It's just him and me in the world. His father. She trailed off. He left us when he found out I was pregnant. Richard looked at her. Really looked at her. Emily Carter, 29 years old. A housekeeper who cleaned 5 houses a week to support her son alone, lived in a low-income neighborhood, 2 hours by bus from Crestwood Manor, as no family and no support, just her and Ethan against the world, exactly like 200 years ago. Except back then, She was the aristocrat, and he, the poor man. No, Richard shook his head. Stop, this is madness. Are you all right, Mr. Blackwood? Emily asked, seeing his troubled expression. Yes, I'm just tired. A lie. He wasn't tired. He was terrified, because the visions were getting more frequent, more vivid, more real. That night, when Emily finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell into a deep sleep for the first time in days, Richard stayed awake, watching Ethan. The baby stirred in his sleep. Small sounds, movement of his lips, as if he were nursing. And then, without warning, the vision returned. This time it wasn't quick. It was slow, detailed, immersive. Richard found himself in a simple room, rough stone walls, smell of medicinal herbs, thick tallow candles providing meager light. He was wearing period clothing, brown linen pants, white shirt with wide cuffs, a smock over it, stained with blood and substances he couldn't identify. And in his arms, a baby, Ethan, or the 1820 version of him, crying weakly, pale skin, purple lips, dying. In the doorway, a woman, Emily, but not the 29-year-old Emily, housekeeper. Poor. This Emily wore a blue dress embroidered in gold, jewels on her neck, hair styled in an elaborate updo, and in her eyes, the same despair. Do something, she pleaded. Please, doctor, save my son. And Richard, or whoever he was in 1820, looked at the baby and knew there was nothing he could do. The fever was too high. The infection had already taken over his little body. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without IV fluids, there was no salvation. I'm so sorry, he heard his own voice say, with a different accent, words in old-fashioned English. There's nothing more I can do. No, Emily screamed. You have to try. I'll pay whatever it takes. Gold, land, anything you want. It's not a matter of payment, Miss Emily. His voice sad, resigned. It's that medicine hasn't gotten there yet. We don't know how to cure this kind of sickness. And then he saw it, saw the baby take his last breath, saw Emily collapse on the stone floor, saw himself, helpless, holding the lifeless body, saw, days later, the guards of the wealthy family arriving, accusing him of negligence, of letting the aristocrat's son die. Him, being arrested, tried by people who didn't understand that medicine had limits, condemned. And the last image, the rope around his neck, the public square, Emily in the crowd, thin, destroyed, her eyes empty, and him, before the chair was kicked out and shouting, I'll be back. I swear I'll be back, and next time I'll save him. Richard woke from the trance with a muffled scream. Sweat poured down his face. His heart raced uncontrollably. He looked around, disoriented. Hospital. 21st century. Reality. Emily stirred in her sleep, but didn't wake up. Ethan continued sleeping. Peacefully. That had been a memory, not imagination, not a dream. Memory. Richard got up on wobbly legs. He left the room, went to the restroom down the hall, faced his reflection in the mirror, his face, and but for a second he saw another, the same face, but younger, with a fuller beard, longer hair, eyes with the same deep sadness. He gripped the sink tightly, trying to anchor himself in reality, but reality was slipping away because now he knew it wasn't madness, it wasn't projection, it wasn't coincidence, it was real. All of it was real. He had lived before in 1820. As a poor doctor named, the name came automatically as Richard Blackwood. The same name, the same soul, treating the son of the aristocrat Emily Carter, failing, being executed, making a promise. And 200 years later, here he was, a millionaire this time, with access to modern medicine, with the power to pay for the best treatment, finally able to fulfill the promise, save Ethan. What would you do if you discovered you'd known someone for 200 years? If you knew you'd failed once, and destiny was giving you a second chance? Richard went back to the room, sat down, and for the first time since Michael died, he cried. He cried for the child he couldn't save 3 years ago. He cried for the baby he couldn't save 200 years ago, and he wept with relief, because this time, finally, he was succeeding. Ethan, no, it can't be. Richard looked up. Emily was awake, and looking at him with a strange expression. Fear mixed with something that seemed like recognition? Mr. Blackwood, why are you crying? Richard wiped his face quickly. I'm sorry, Memories of my son. Gabriel. He was Ethan's age when he died. Emily finished softly. I know. I found the photo once while cleaning. I'm so sorry. Silence. Just the rhythmic beep of Ethan's monitor. The baby's peaceful breathing. And then Emily said something that made Richard's world stop. You know, what's strange is, ever since I started working at Crestwood Manor, I've been having dreams. Very vivid dreams. I'm in another time, wearing old-fashioned clothes. I'm wealthy, living in a mansion, and I have a baby who gets sick. And there's a doctor. She paused, looking at Richard. A doctor who looks just like you. Richard couldn't breathe. Emily continued, her voice trembling. In the dream, the baby dies, and I blame the doctor. And he's killed because of me. And I spend the rest of my life with guilt. And when I die, I make a promise. I promise that if we meet again, I will trust him. I will let him help me. I will let him save your son, Richard finished. Emily's eyes widened. How do you know that? Because I have the same dreams, Richard admitted. Only from the doctor's side. Absolute silence. They stared at each other. Across the hospital room, as across 200 years, across 2 lifetimes. This is insane, Emily whispered. I know. But it's real, isn't it? Richard looked at Ethan, at the crescent moon-shaped birthmark that he'd sketched before ever seeing it, at the pattern of crying that he knew without ever having heard it, at the memories that weren't his, but were. It's real. And that's when it happened. Emily got up and went to a small backpack that she had brought on the second day. When she went to get clothes, she opened it, searched, and took something out. An old piece of paper, yellowed, folded carefully. She opened it slowly, as if it might fall apart at any moment. This belonged to my great-grandmother. She left it to me when she died, said it was very important, that I should always keep it safe. I never understood why, until now. She held out the paper to Richard. He took it. And when he looked at it, the flaw disappeared. It was a death certificate. Handwritten, in Old Spanish, dated March 19, 1820, and it read, I attest that the minor Mateo Rivera, son of Doña Camila Rivera, passed away on this date at 9 months of age, due to malignant fever. Treatment performed by Dr. Ricardo Montellano proved insufficient. Signed, Padre Alfonso Mendez. Richard read it over and over. His hands trembled so much that the paper shook. The names? The same names. Mateo Rivera, Camila Rivera, Ricardo Montellano. 200 years ago. Documented. Real. Where did you get this? Richard asked, his voice hoarse. My great-grandmother said it came from family, that our family used to be wealthy. Aristocrats in colonial Mexico. But they lost everything after a tragedy happened. after the matriarch's only son died, and after she caused the unjust death of a doctor. The family was cursed, they said, fell into poverty, never recovered. Emily had tears in her eyes. I never believed it. I thought it was a legend. But now, she looked at Ethan. Now I'm seeing the same story repeat itself. My son Ethan, 9 months old, sick with a fever, and a doctor. She looked at Richard. No, not a doctor, a businessman. But who acts like a doctor? Who knows things he shouldn't? Who has the same name? Richard held the ancient document as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And it was. It was proof. Physical. Documentary. Irrefutable proof that this wasn't madness, that they really had lived before, that they had met again, and this time, the story was going to be different. Emily, Richard said, standing up. In 1820, I failed. Matteo died. You blamed me. I was executed. We both lived and died with guilt and pain. But now, he looked at the sleeping baby, healthy, recovering. Now we have a second chance. To save Ethan, Emily whispered. To save Ethan, Richard confirmed. And to save ourselves, too. She approached, stood inches from him, looked deep into his eyes. And Richard saw it, saw the same soul, the same woman who 200 years ago begged for help, who lost her son, who caused an unjust death, who died of heartbreak. I'm so sorry, Emily said, tears streaming down, for what I did to you in 1820, for blaming you, for... You were suffering, Richard interrupted, and I couldn't save him. The fault was mine. No, it wasn't anyone's fault. It was just fate. Or it was, Richard said, because now we change fate. They looked at Ethan, at the baby who in another life had died, and who in this life was alive, breathing, healing, surviving. And that's when Dr. Abernathy walked into the room, smiling. Good morning. I came to give you the good news. Today's tests showed significant improvement. The infection is responding to treatment. If it continues like this, Ethan can be discharged in 2 days. Emily burst into tears of relief. Richard closed his eyes. The gratitude so intense that it hurt in his chest. Saved. Ethan was saved. The promise from 200 years ago had been fulfilled that afternoon, with Ethan finally awake, without a fever, smiling. Emily did something unexpected. She held out the baby to Richard. Hold him. He likes you. Richard took the child, and Ethan, instead of being wary, laughed, a high-pitched giggle of a happy baby, and he grabbed Richard's finger with his small but strong hand. And in that touch, Richard felt the connection. Across time, across lives, across the fulfilled promise. Welcome back, Ethan, Richard whispered. This time, you will grow up. This time, you will live. Emily rested her head on Richard's shoulder, and the three of them, united there in that hospital room, formed an impossible image. A poor housekeeper, a wealthy millionaire, and a baby who had died 200 years ago. Souls that transcended time, social class, and death. Souls that had finally found their way back to each other, and this time, nothing would separate them but fate, as always, had other plans. 2 days later, exactly as Dr. Abernathy had promised, Ethan was discharged. The fever had completely disappeared. The blood test showed that the infection was under control. The baby was healthy, active, smiling. A miracle. The nurse said as she handed over the discharge papers. A few more hours, and it might have been too late. Richard covered the entire hospital bill. $52,000. Emily tried to protest, insisting she'd pay him back little by little, but he just shook his head. It's not something you pay back, he said softly. And then, without much thought, he offered, "Let me give you both a ride. Where do you live?" Emily hesitated. The conflict was etched on her face. Accepting more help from her millionaire boss? But she was exhausted. Ethan felt heavy in her arms. The 3-bus journey to the outskirts, with a baby fresh out of the hospital, would be pure torture. "Okay, thank you." On the drive, Richard saw it. He really saw it. The brutal contrast between their two worlds. His glass mansion in a luxury gated community, and Emily's house, a wooden shack in a slum, thin walls, a corrugated iron roof, a cement floor, a single room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. A tiny bathroom in the back. Emily went inside with Ethan, ashamed. "Sorry about the mess up. I wasn't expecting company." Richard looked around. The single bed where she and Ethan slept together, the 2-burner stove, the small, old refrigerator that made a strange noise, the clothes hanging on a makeshift clothesline. And then he saw the crib, in the corner, broken. One of the legs was held together with duct tape, the mattress thin, worn out, a patched-up sheet. Something inside Richard broke, for the second time that week. "You can't keep living here," he said. Emily froze. "What do you mean?" "It's not safe. Not for you. Not for Ethan. The roof leaks. The wiring is exposed. There's no proper ventilation if Ethan gets sick again." "Mr. Blackwood," Emily interrupted, her voice tight, "with all due respect, this is my home. It's all I have. I know it's not a mansion like yours, but it's mine." "That's not what I meant." Richard backed down. "I'm sorry. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I just want to help." Emily sat on the bed, Ethan in her lap. The baby played with her fingers, oblivious to the tension. "Why do you care so much?" Emily asked, looking directly at him. "I know we have this strange connection, these memories, but that doesn't mean you have any obligation to me. I can take care of my son myself. I always have." Richard sat down next to her on the bed. The mattress sagged under his weight. "In 1820, I failed. Ethan died, and you died of heartbreak a month later. I saw it in the visions. I saw you wither away, stop eating, stop living. And I couldn't do anything because I was already dead too." Richard looked at her. "I've spent 200 years carrying that guilt, and now that I have the chance to make a difference, you expect me to just go back to my mansion and pretend nothing happened?" Emily had tears in her eyes, but her voice came out firm. "I've carried guilt for 200 years too. Guilt for having you killed, for being too proud, too blind to see that you did everything you could. And when I reincarnated this time, I chose a hard life. Poverty, abandonment, struggle, because I thought I deserved to suffer." "You don't deserve to suffer," Richard said. "Neither did you deserve to die," Emily replied. Silence. Ethan yawned, tired from the journey. Emily placed him in the broken crib. The baby fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted. And then Richard said something that would change everything. "Move in with me." Emily turned so quickly that she almost lost her balance. "What?" "At Crestwood Manor. There are empty rooms. You can keep working if you want, but at least you'll have a safe place. Ethan will have a real crib. You won't have to take 3 buses a day, and I..." Richard stopped. "And I'll be able to make sure you're both okay. Mr. Blackwood, this is..." "Crazy," Richard completed. "I know. But none of this has made sense from the beginning, right? 200 years. Same names. Same story. And this time we have the chance to do things differently. So let's do things differently." Emily looked at Ethan. at her son sleeping in a broken crib in a shack where the rain came in when it rained hard. And then she looked at Richard, at the man who was her boss, but who was also something else, something she couldn't name but felt deep in her soul. "Okay," she whispered, "but with one condition. I stay your housekeeper. I work, I clean, I don't accept charity. Deal." They moved in 3 days later. Richard arranged everything: furniture, a new crib, clothes, everything Ethan needed. Emily stayed in a room on the second floor, near what had been Gabriel's. Richard, on the third floor, in the master bedroom, during the first few weeks, so it was strange, formal. Emily woke up early, cleaned the house, took care of Ethan. Richard went to work, came back late. They had dinner together sometimes and talking about trivialities, the weather, Richard's clients, Ethan's development. But at night, when the house was silent, the visions returned. Richard dreamed of 1820. He saw fragments, memories. The first time Emily appeared in his clinic, pregnant, asking for prenatal care because the wealthy doctors refused a single aristocrat. Him taking care of her for months, the baby being born, Ethan, healthy and beautiful. Emily always coming back, saying she only trusted Dr. Blackwood. And then the fever, the illness, the 3 days trying to save the child, the despair, the failure, the death, the accusation, the arrest, the sentence, the rope. Richard would wake up sweating, trembling, and he'd hear Ethan crying in the next room. And he'd go there. Emily was always already awake, breastfeeding the baby, humming a lullaby that Richard recognized, because she sang the same song 200 years ago. "Are you having the visions too?" Emily asked one night, when she realized that Richard wasn't surprised to see her awake. "Every night. Me too. It's getting stronger, clearer, like..." She stopped. "Like we're remembering completely," Richard completed. Ethan finished feeding and fell asleep. Emily put him in the crib and covered him with a soft blanket, so different from the broken crib from before. She sat in the rocking chair next to it. Richard leaned against the doorframe. "Do you remember the end?" Emily asked, her voice low. "How you died? I remember, hanging, in the main square, with a crowd watching. And you were there." "I was," Emily confirmed, silent tears falling. "In the front row. Because the law said that the victim's family had to witness the execution. And I had to stand there and watch you die because of me. It wasn't your fault. It was. I accused you. I told the authorities that you had killed my son through negligence, that you weren't a real doctor, that you were a charlatan. All lies. I knew you did everything you could, but I was crazy with grief and needed to blame someone. And I accepted it," Richard said. "In those visions, I remember, when they asked if I had anything to say in my defense, I said no, because I blamed myself too, because I felt I deserved to die." The two of them sat in silence, two souls burdened with 200 years of guilt, 200 years of regret, 200 years searching for redemption, and then Ethan made a small noise in his sleep, a tiny sigh, and smiled. Emily and Richard looked at him, at the baby who in another life had died, and who in this life was alive, healthy, growing. "We did it," Emily whispered. "We changed fate." Richard agreed, but then he asked something that had haunted him since the beginning. What now? Now that the promise has been fulfilled, now that Ethan is safe, what happens to us? Emily looked at him, and in the depths of those hazel eyes, Richard saw the same question, the same doubt, the same fear. Because the truth was, They weren't just doctor and patient. They weren't just employer and housekeeper. They weren't just two people sharing strange memories. They were souls connected across centuries, and what that meant in the present. In the real world, neither of them. Anew, some people might pause here. They'll need a moment to process, because what comes next isn't just a revelation, it's a transformation. It was 2 months after Ethan was discharged from the hospital that it happened. Richard was in his home office, working late. Emily had put Ethan to bed and was in the kitchen, brewing tea. A routine had settled in, comfortable, familiar, almost like a family. Except they weren't a family. They were a solitary millionaire, a struggling housekeeper, and a baby. Nothing more. Or was it? Richard saved the document on his computer and stretched. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. He should sleep, but he couldn't. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily. Not the Emily from 1820, the Emily of now. Smiling as she played with Ethan, humming as she cooked, sitting in the garden, reading a book Richard had lent her. He was falling in love. Or was it falling in love again? Because the visions showed it. They showed that in 1820, it wasn't just a doctor-patient relationship. It was more. Emily, a single woman from a prominent family, ostracized by society for becoming pregnant out of wedlock, found in Richard not just a doctor, but a friend, a confidant, and perhaps something more. And Richard, a poor doctor who cared for the forgotten of society, found in Emily someone who saw him as an equal, not as inferior because of his class, but as human, as a man. They had never admitted it. The social barriers were too high. Rich and poor didn't mix in colonial Mexico. But the feeling was there, unspoken, unrealized, but real. And now, 200 years later, with the barriers still present but different, the feeling was returning. Richard went down to the kitchen. Emily was there, as he imagined, cup of chamomile tea in hand, looking out the window at the illuminated garden. "Can't sleep?" Richard asked. Emily turned, not startled, as if she had expected him to come. "I never can. Lately the visions are so intense. I'm afraid to sleep." "Me too." Richard grabbed a mug and poured himself some tea. He sat at the kitchen island. Emily sat beside him. And then, without warning, the vision came. But this time, it wasn't just for Richard, it was for both of them. Simultaneous, shared. They saw it together. The stone room, 1820. But not the sickness part, not the death part. A different memory. Emily, 8 months pregnant, crying. Richard holding her hands and comforting her, saying that everything would be all right, that he would take care of her and the baby, that it didn't matter what society said, that she wasn't alone. And Emily looking at him with gratitude, with affection, with something deeper, and whispering, "How I wish I had met you in another life, where there were no barriers and where I could..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Richard understood, and he responded, "In another life, I'll find you again. And this time, there will be no barriers. This time, we will." The vision dissipated. Richard and Emily returned to the present, to the modern kitchen, to the cooling tea, to the heavy silence. "You saw it?" Emily whispered. "I did. It was love. In 1820, we loved each other." Richard finished, but we could never admit it. The social barriers, the fear, and then Ethan died, and it was all over before it began. Emily took Richard's hand. Their intertwined fingers seemed to fit perfectly, as if they had done it 1,000 times before. "What now?" Emily asked, her eyes glistening with tears. "Now that we remember, now that we know." Richard looked at their joined hands, at the woman beside him, at the impossible truth that could no longer be denied. "Now," he said slowly, "we do what we couldn't do in 1820. And he leaned in, and he kissed her. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, as if they were asking permission not just from each other, but from fate, from time, from the 200 years that separated them. And then it deepened, and everything made sense. The visions, the memories, the inexplicable connection. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was never just about saving a baby. It was about two lovers tragically separated, who promised to find each other again, who were reincarnated with the same names, the same souls, the same story, but this time, with the chance to end differently. When they broke apart, both were crying. "I love you," Emily said. "I don't know if it's crazy to say that. I don't know if it's just a memory from another life, or a feeling from this life. But I love you." "Me too," Richard replied. "I think I always have. 200 years searching for you. And when I saw you at the door that night with Ethan, I knew you had returned." They embraced. There in the illuminated kitchen, two souls finally reunited, finally free to love without barriers. Because although Richard was wealthy and Emily struggling, this time they were in control of their own choices. This time, no one could separate them. Except Richard's phone rang. In the middle of the night. Who would call at this hour? He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was male, young, aggressive. "Are you Richard Blackwood, the millionaire who's with Emily?" Richard frowned. "Who is this?" "I'm Diego, Ethan's father, and I've come to take back what's mine." The line went dead, and Richard felt his blood run cold. Diego, the man who abandoned Emily when she was pregnant, who never wanted to know his son, who disappeared when Ethan was born, and now he was back. Why? Emily had turned pale. She had heard. The phone was on speaker. "He can't take Ethan," she whispered, panic rising. "He never wanted anything to do with him. He has no right. He won't take him." Richard promised, "I won't let him." But that very night, while Emily slept restlessly, and Ethan rested, oblivious to the danger, Richard did some digging. Jake Sullivan, 28 years old, a rap sheet, drug trafficking, assault, domestic violence, and recently released from prison. And apparently, he'd found out that Emily was now living in a millionaire's Crestwood Manor. And where there's a millionaire, there's money. And Jake wanted money. This wasn't about wanting his son. It was about extortion. Richard spent the night planning, lawyers, legal guardianship, protection. He would use every resource he had to protect Emily and Ethan, because it wasn't just about that 200-year-old promise. It was about now. It was about the family they were building. It was about the love they could finally admit, and no one was going to destroy that. The next morning, Jake showed up at the gates of Crestwood Manor, tall, tattoos on his arm, cold eyes, demanding to see his son. Richard answered. Emily stayed upstairs with Ethan, as agreed. "What do you want, Jake?" "I want my son." "And my girl." "Emily isn't your girl. You abandoned her, and Ethan doesn't even know who you are." "I'm the father. I have rights." "Rights you forfeited when you walked out." Jake took a menacing step forward. "Listen here, rich boy. I know how this works. You want to play happy family with what's mine, but it's gonna cost you big time." So, that was it. Blackmail. "How much do you want?" Jake smiled, a humorless smile. 100 grand today, and I disappear." Richard could pay it. $100,000 was nothing to him, but he knew it wouldn't solve anything. Jake would be back, asking for more, and more, and more. "No." Jake's face darkened. "What did you say?" "I said no. You're not getting a dime, and you're not going anywhere near Emily or Ethan. I've already filed a restraining order. It's being processed right now. If you come within 100 yards of them, you'll be back in jail." "You can't do that." "I can, and I did." Richard crossed his arms. "You have two choices. Walk away now and never come back, or be arrested for extortion, threats, and attempted kidnapping. Take your pick." Jake clenched his fists for a moment. Richard thought he was going to attack, but then the man spat on the ground and turned away. "This ain't over," he shouted, as he climbed into his beat-up car and sped away. Richard closed the gate. He went upstairs. He found Emily at the bedroom window, holding Ethan, trembling. "He's gone," Richard said, "and he's not coming back, I guarantee it." Emily broke down. Richard held her, held them both, mother and son, his family, and he vowed in silence that he would never, never let anything bad happen to them, because in 1820 he didn't have the power to protect them, but now he did, and he would use every last drop of that power. Days later, the restraining order was granted. Jake couldn't approach, and because of his criminal record, any violation would result in immediate arrest. He never showed up again, and slowly. Emily began to breathe again, to smile again, to trust that she was safe, and the unlikely, impossible. Wonderful family they had formed began to grow. 6 months passed. Ethan was 15 months old now, walking, saying a few words, laughing constantly, a healthy, happy, loved child. Richard and Emily no longer hid their relationship. There was no point in hiding it. The staff at Crestwood Manor knew, Richard's friends knew, and no one questioned it, because anyone who saw the three of them together understood. There was something special there, something that transcended rational explanations. It was on a Saturday afternoon that the last piece of the impossible puzzle fell into place. Richard was in the attic of Crestwood Manor. The house was over 100 years old. It had been in the family since his great-grandfather, and the attic, a place Richard rarely visited, was filled with old trunks, furniture covered in sheets, family documents. He was looking for his great-grandfather's will, needed it for a late probate case, but when he opened one particular trunk, made of dark wood with brass locks, he found something that made time stand still. A box, smaller, made of cedar wood, with delicate carvings, and an inscription on the lid, in Old Spanish. Property of Dr. Richard Blackwood, 1820. Richard's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, carefully preserved, were objects from 200 years ago, a primitive wooden stethoscope, a leather-bound diary, and portraits. 3 miniature, hand-painted portraits, the kind aristocrats used to commission in the 19th century. Richard picked up the portraits carefully, and when he looked, the world turned upside down. The first portrait showed a man, 30 years old, maybe, dark hair, well-groomed beard, deep-set eyes, and although the painting technique was different, although 200 years separated the images, Richard recognized him. It was him, or rather, it was who he was in 1820. The second portrait was of a woman, beautiful, embroidered blue dress, jewelry around her neck, her hair in an elaborate updo, huge hazel eyes, Emily, the Emily of 1820, and the third portrait, the smallest one, a baby, 9 months old, maybe, white christening clothes, and on his left ankle, painted with precise detail, a crescent moon-shaped birthmark. Ethan. Richard sat down on the dusty attic floor, the portraits in his hands, weeping. The definitive proof, the visual, documentary, irrefutable proof. They really existed, 200 years ago, in the same house where Richard lived now, with the same faces, the same souls. And then he opened the diary. The yellowed pages crumbled at the edges. The handwriting was old cursive, difficult to read, but he managed, and he read. March 19th, 1820. Today was the worst day of my life. Ethan, Miss Emily's son, died in my arms. 3 days battling the malignant fever, 3 days without sleep, trying everything medicine knows. And I failed. He died. And I saw the light go out in Emily's eyes. She blames me, and she's right, I should have saved him, but I couldn't, and now I fear they will come for me. Because when the wealthy lose children, the poor pay the price. Richard turned the pages. More entries. More despair. March 20th, 1820. The guards came. I was accused of medical malpractice. I will be judged tomorrow. I know I will be convicted. Not because I am guilty, but because I am poor and she is rich. That is how the world works. But before I die, I need to write the truth. I loved Emily from the first time she entered my clinic. Pregnant, scared, rejected by the world. I loved her, and I loved Ethan as if he were my own son. And I would do it all again, even knowing it would end like this. And the last entry, written in a trembling hand. March 21st, 1820. Tomorrow, I will be hanged. I spent the entire night praying, not for salvation, but for a second chance. I promised the heavens, if reincarnation exists, if souls truly return, I will find them again. Emily and Ethan. I will find them in another life, and this time I will save them. This time I will not fail. I swear this with my last breath. I will return, and I will do things differently. Richard closed the diary, tears soaking the ancient pages. He had made the promise. 200 years ago, written with his own hand, the promise to return, to save, to do things differently, and he had kept it. "Emily!" Richard shouted, rushing down the attic stairs, the cedar box clutched in his arms. She was in the living room, playing with Ethan. The baby was building a tower with colorful blocks. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, alarmed by his frantic state. Richard placed the box on the coffee table, opened it, and showed her the portraits. Emily gasped. She picked up her portrait, or rather, the version of her from 1820. Her fingers trembled. This is me." "It was you," Richard corrected. "In 1820. I found it in the attic. This house has belonged to my family for generations, and apparently, the Dr. Richard Blackwood of 1820 lived here. He was my great-great-grandfather, or rather, he paused, or rather, it was me, in another life." Emily picked up Richard's portrait. Then Ethan's. Tears streamed down her face. "We're really in the same pictures, 200 years ago, as a family." Richard showed her the diary. "Read it, the last entry." Emily read, and when she reached the promise, she broke down. Richard held both her and Ethan, who had stopped playing and was looking at his parents with childish concern. "You kept it," Emily sobbed. "The promise. You came back. You found us. You saved him. Everything you promised. You did." "We did," Richard corrected. "Because you also promised. You promised to trust me this time, and you did. When you showed up at my door that night with Ethan so sick, you trusted me, even without knowing why, even without understanding. You handed me your son, and I saved him." They stayed embraced for long minutes. Ethan, not understanding but sensing the emotion, hugged their legs. And then Richard did something he'd been planning for weeks. He knelt, pulled a small box from his pocket, and opened it. A diamond ring sparkled. "Emily Carter, in 1820. I loved you, but I couldn't be with you. The social barriers were too high, and we lost everything before we even began. But now, 200 years later, there are no barriers I can't break down. There's no destiny I can't change. There's no promise I won't keep." Richard took a deep breath. "Marry me, it's us this time, that's is forever, in this life, and in all the lives to come." Emily covered her mouth with her hands. Tears of joy now. "Yes, Yes. 1,000 times yes. Richard put the ring on her finger, and when they stood up, Ethan applauded, as if he knew. As if the ancient soul inside that little body understood that finally, the family was complete. This story shouldn't exist, but it needs to be told. Because some connections transcend death, time, and all the laws of logic. They were married 2 months later. A small ceremony. Just close friends and the house staff. But when Richard said, "I do," and Emily said, "I do," something in the air shifted, as if the universe sighed in relief, as if a 200-year-old cosmic debt had finally been paid. On their wedding night, lying together for the first time as husband and wife, Emily whispered, "Do you think the visions will stop now?" Richard thought. The visions had lessened in recent weeks, less frequent, less intense, as if, with the promise fulfilled and the love realized, they were no longer necessary. "I think so. I think the past can finally rest." "And Ethan? Do you think he remembers? Does he know?" Richard glanced at the room next door, where the baby slept. "I don't know. Maybe he'll forget when he grows up, or maybe he'll keep it deep in his soul. But one thing I do know, in this life, he's going to grow up. He's going to have a mother and father. He's going to be loved. He's going to have all the chances he didn't have in 1820. And we," Emily said, "will have all the chances we didn't have." Exactly. They fell asleep embraced, and for the first time in months, there were no visions and no nightmares, just peace, profound and deserved. 3 years passed. Ethan was 4 years old now, a bright, happy, curious child. He didn't remember the illness. He didn't remember the hospital. To him, Richard had always been dad. Emily had always been mom, and Crestwood Manor had always been home. Richard and Emily had another child, a girl, Sophia. And this time, there were no complications, no illness, no scares, just joy. Ethan's birthmark began to fade, little by little, year after year. The crescent moon on his ankle became lighter, weaker, until it almost disappeared, as if, with the promise fulfilled, it was no longer needed. But Richard and Emily kept the portraits, they kept the diary, they kept the death certificate from 1820, evidence of a past life, of a love that transcended time, of a promise that took 200 years to fulfill, and sometimes, on special nights, when the children were asleep, they would take out the cedar block, look at the faces of who they once were, and give thanks. They thanked each other for finding each other again, for having a second chance, for changing destiny. On one of those nights, Emily asked, "Do you think we'll find each other again? 200 years from now, in another life?" Richard smiled, took her hand, the wedding ring sparkling. "I don't know if reincarnation exists. I don't know if we'll come back. But if we do, I'll look for you. In every life, in every era, in every place. Because some souls are meant to be together, and mine recognizes yours. Always has. Always will." Emily kissed her husband. And in that kiss was gratitude for the second chance, for the love realized, for the family they had built, and for Ethan. Ethan, who in 1820 died at 9 months old, and who in 2025 was alive, healthy, sleeping in the next room, living proof that promises can be kept, that love is stronger than death, that some stories don't end, they just begin again. So if you've ever felt like you've known someone forever, if you've ever looked at a person and felt a deep, inexplicable recognition, if you've ever had the feeling that you've lived before, loved before, promised before, maybe it's not madness, maybe it's memory. Memory of who you were, of who you loved, of the promises you still need to keep. Because if Richard Blackwood could wait 200 years to save Ethan, if Emily Carter could carry guilt through entire lifetimes, if two lovers could find each other again, with the same names, in the same souls, in the same house, then nothing is impossible, not even eternal love. Richard held Emily tighter that night and whispered against her hair the words he had written 200 years ago. I promised I would return, and I have returned. I promised I would find you, and I have found you. I promised I would save him, and I did save him. And now I promise again that nothing, not death, not time, not fate, will ever separate us. Never again. And this time, unlike in 1820, they would have forever. Ethan woke up in the middle of the night, not crying, just awake. He climbed out of bed and walked to his parents' room. The door was slightly ajar. Mommy? Daddy? Richard woke up first. Come here, champ. Is everything all right? Ethan climbed into the bed, snuggling between his parents. Emily woke up and hugged her son. I had a dream, Ethan said, his childish voice still sleepy. What did you dream about? Sweetie, Emily asked. I dreamed that I was a baby again, and I was sick, and I was scared. But then you appeared, Daddy, and you held me. And I knew that everything was going to be okay, because you always save me. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Always, son, I will always save you. Ethan yawned and closed his eyes, falling asleep between his parents. And Richard and Emily looked at each other over their little boy's head. He remembers, Emily whispered. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a dream. Either way, it's true. Richard kissed his son's forehead. I will always save him. I promised that 200 years ago, and I will keep promising, in this life and in all the next ones. The moonlight streamed in through the window, illuminating the three of them, father, mother, and son. Family. Souls connected through time, promises fulfilled, love triumphant. And outside, in the city that continued to live even at night, other stories were happening. Other promises were being made. Other souls were searching for each other through time. Because true love never dies. It just waits. Waits for the next life, for the next encounter, for the next chance to do things differently. And when two souls that truly love each other meet again, nothing can stop them. Not death, not 200 years, not all the barriers in the world. They simply recognize each other and begin again. Like Richard and Emily began again. Like Ethan survived. Like a promise from 1820 was fulfilled in 2025. And how love, true and eternal, always finds a way back home.